Hi, I'm Ann. Remember me? This is the second episode of the writing block. In the previous episode, we talked about the format of the test and the questions and began to discuss some strategies for taking the written test. In this episode, we will see how to structure an answer to the independent question. Let's also see why it's important to learn a set of words and expressions that usually appear in answers. We will see some examples of these words and expressions. Then we will try to build an answer to that question that we saw in the previous episode. If you've been following the course and reading the book, you should already have a good idea of how to handle this, and it's only going to get better, because we're just getting started. And speaking of getting started, here we go.
What's up? Are we ready to try to answer that question? If you don't remember, have a look again. Some people believe that newspaper is the best source of news. Others feel that news is best presented on radio or television. Which of these news sources do you prefer? Give specific reasons and examples to justify your choice. We talked about choosing the newspaper because you can read it whenever you want, and radio and television, you have to obey the schedule. We were to think of examples to show the advantage of being able to read the newspaper whenever you want. So, did you think of examples? Didn't you? Then you can think about it now. Just pause the video. You can even take a break. Or continue watching and do the exercise later. I know there must be people out there thinking that, on the internet, we can also listen to radio and television news whenever we want. It is true. This reason is a bit outdated, it's not very current. But that doesn't matter, because we can use any reason we want. Maybe you can think of something better. To tell the truth, I don't usually read the newspaper myself, but I would write the following. As I work in sales and have to visit a number of clients every day, I usually read the newspaper while I am waiting to talk to each client, so I don't get bored. No one seems to mind, but if I were to watch television or listen to the radio instead of reading the newspaper, I would probably lose my job because people would find it disrespectful. Let's think of other reasons. Like, newspaper I can examine carefully because it is physical, radio and television news is spoken, so as soon as it's presented, it's gone. Example, if I get lost reading the newspaper, I can go back to where I got lost and read it again. But with television and radio I cannot do that. Another reason, I think newspaper news has more substance, because journalists have time to research and think well before they write, but in radio and television everything is more superficial, because it needs to be quick, both in preparation and in presentation. Example, when I talk to other people about the news, I usually know details that others don't, and I think it's because I read the newspaper and they see it on television. In the exam, we have half an hour to prepare and write the answer, so it's good to practice a lot to be able to organize the text well and write at least the 300 words they want. Want to try building an answer to see how long it takes you? Then go ahead.
Did you understand how this section of the TOEFL written test works? Now that we know a bit better what we need to do, let's talk about how we prepare to write this in English. This task is very similar to the independent task of the oral test. Anyone who watched the first episode of the speaking block will definitely remember. This is one of the advantages of studying for this exam. It's all very connected, so studying for one type of test, you end up preparing for other types as well, and even for other situations that have nothing to do with the exam. You will see. But let's start by thinking about the vocabulary we need. Remember that part of it depends on the question, but there is another part that we can always use. Let's call this recyclable vocabulary. It is recyclable because we will reuse it in different answers. So let's see. We just need to analyze the question and the types of possible answers to identify the recyclable vocabulary and expressions. Let's analyze the wording of the question. Some people believe that newspaper is the best source of news. Others think that the news is presented better on radio or television. Which of these sources of news do you prefer? Give specific reasons and examples to justify your choice. Like the question we saw in the first episode of the speaking block, this one also has 3 parts. The first part presents the ideas. Some people believe that newspaper is the best source of news. Others think that the news is presented better on radio or television. We need to understand these ideas to be able to develop a good response. The second part asks which idea you prefer. Which of these sources of news do you prefer? That's what we have to answer. The third part gives instructions. Give specific reasons and examples to justify your choice. To get the best result, we address all parts of the question. The golden rule, remember. That is, decide which alternative we prefer, explain why we prefer this one and not the other, and give examples that demonstrate what we explained. And how do we do this in English? What is the recyclable vocabulary? Of course, we can use I prefer, as in the oral test. But we can also use other expressions. Let's see some. I prefer the newspapers. I like to read the news on the papers. I usually read the papers. I always get the news from the newspaper. And the recyclable vocabulary to talk about reasons. Because. That's because. For this reason. That is why. It is also interesting to compare the alternatives, and it is good to have a repertoire of vocabulary and expressions for this as well. Here are some. But. However. On the other hand. In contrast. If we have 2 or 3 reasons, and compare our choice with the others, we will certainly be able to write much more than the 300 words that the question is asking for.
This was the second episode of the writing block. We saw some strategies to use in the written test and discussed how to structure our answer for the independent question. We also saw that it is important to develop a repertoire of words and expressions to facilitate writing when we take the exam. We saw some examples of vocabulary and expressions to talk about preferences, reasons, and to compare alternatives. Be sure to watch the next episode. We'll continue talking about vocabulary, and we'll start exploring the assessment criteria used in the TOEFL written test. So until the next episode. See you then. Oh, almost forgot. Subscribe to the channel and watch this space.